Welcome to the Loss Control webinar series. Today's presentation is titled Blood and Tissue, Products Liability, Risk and Implications. I'm Heather Thompson, Internet Marketing Manager at Medmarc. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenters, Kate Klaus and Courtney Stevens, thank you for joining us. Kate Klaus is a loss control attorney with Medmarc Insurance Group. Her focus is on legal matters faced by participants in the life sciences industry, specifically FDA regulatory compliance. She began her career with FDA's Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, where she worked on the broad-spectrum autism litigation under the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. After leaving FDA, she worked in private practice with two national law firms, counseling clients through all phases of the regulated product life cycle, including development and approval, manufacturing, labeling and advertising, and post-market concerns and enforcement. She has advised clients regarding defense against regulatory enforcement actions, including FDA 483 inspectional observations, warning letters, U.S. custom detentions, and product recalls. She now brings this experience in navigating the FDA landscape to Medmarc, where she works with colleagues in-house as well as with policyholders in developing regulatory compliance strategies in an effort to mitigate product liability loss. Kate is a graduate of the Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law, and the College of Holy Cross. Courtney Stevens is the Senior Attorney for Loss Control for the Medmarc Insurance Group. Her primary responsibilities include the development of resources on product liability avoidance and regular correspondence with brokers, policyholders, and underwriters in an effort to evaluate and mitigate product liability risk. Ms. Stevens publishes articles on product liability risk management for industry organizations such as IMDA and publications such as Life Sciences Panorama. She also maintains a blog on product liability issues for the life sciences industry, in which she discusses recent product liability litigation, FDA regulatory activity, and industry news. Ms. Stevens received her law degree from George Mason University School of Law, where she finished the top quarter of her class, and is a member of the California and District of Columbia bars. She is also a graduate of the University of California, Santa Barbara, where she received dual BA degrees in business economics and political science. With that, I am pleased to turn things over to Kate, who will begin today's presentation.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this month. We're going to begin today by talking about the use of human tissue products in conjunction with biologics, drugs, and medical devices. It's a market that is growing rapidly, and with that rapid growth comes a host of new products liability, vulnerabilities, and risks. Today, we would like to talk about this segment of the industry in order to demonstrate some of these vulnerabilities. We hope that this will help you to begin to mitigate the risks that you or your clients may face. We will begin by taking a look at what these products are and how they're regulated. We have an interesting case study that looks at the intersection of tissue products and devices. And from the case study, we will look at how adjusting a few facts can totally change the trajectory of potential litigation. And finally, we will take the lessons learned from the litigation of our case study and discuss how to use these lessons to mitigate risks going forward. So first, what are human cellular and tissue-based products? It's important to remember that this category specifically excludes vascularized human organs for transplantation and whole blood, as well as non-human tissue. So anything that comes from an animal other than a human, anything like a heart or a kidney or something like that with its own blood system that is transferred from one donor to the recipient would be excluded from the definition of cellular and tissue-based products. But as you can see from the diagram, depending upon the tissue recovered, the donor can be living or deceased, and it really is a vast range of tissue types that can be donated from one patient to another. One of the key terms to understand when you're working with this category of products is minimal manipulation, because this is a standard by which the degree of post-recovery processing can turn the final product from a tissue product into a biological or a medical device that would be regulated by a different segment of the FDA. So what this means is that if you're talking about a structural tissue, it means that processing that you do to the device, to the tissue after it is recovered from the donor, it cannot change any of the original relevant characteristics of the tissue. And it's the same for cells or non-structural tissue, that it has to remain within the bounds of the original characteristics. If your processing goes outside of that, then it's no longer in the human tissue portion. It becomes either a device or biologic or whatever the case may be, depending upon the particulars of what you're doing. Human tissue products are regulated by the FDA. They are overseen by the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, which is referred to as CBER, and they regulate all human cells, tissues, and cellular and tissue-based products. These products are regulated in a way that is very similar to how FDA treats drugs and devices and biologics, in that they've created a framework of regulations, and then companies take this framework and they apply it to their particular operations, so that FDA isn't specifically dictating how you do each process. You're taking what they want the end result to be, and you're applying it to your own way of operating your facility. In this case, the regulations happen to also require very stringent medical histories for the donors, as well as testing of the donor tissue. There are specific infectious diseases that are expected to be tested for before the tissue can be placed into the recipient. It's looking for infections like HIV, hepatitis B or C, syphilis, cytomegalovirus, and Epstein-Barr. There's also, depending upon the type of tissue, they might need to test for tuberculosis or other infectious diseases. So this testing is intended to keep the population safe from acquiring an infection from the donor source. And if the donor does come back with a positive test result for any of these infectious pathogens, then they are no longer eligible to be a donor. At that point, if someone is waiting for a specific donation, they would have to continue to wait until another suitable donation is made, or they would have to draw on other devices in the market that may be suitable to take the place of a human tissue. And if we move to the next slide, we can take a look at some of the relevant FDA regulations. These are some of the specific things in the framework that FDA has created. The framework is referred to as the Current Good Tissue Practices. And it requires that all firms who are working in this area, the human tissue field, that they are registered with FDA, much like a device or a drug company would be. And they have to list all of the human cellular tissues and products that they are producing, recovering, manipulating, however the facts fall within the practices of the company. They are responsible for either screening and testing all of the donors, or to ensure that the screening and testing has been required. And they're required to build a quality system, much like FDA demands of drug or device manufacturers, so that there is essential record keeping, and the company is able to trace the product through recovery from the donor, through all of its testing and all of its processing, and to the donor and to the recipient of the tissue. And it's important under these regulations to look at your relationship with your business partners. So if you are working with a vendor that is a tissue bank, you need to have a contractual relationship with them to ensure that they are complying with the FDA regulations that may be in the steps that are necessary prior to your company taking custody of the product. So you would want to ensure that the tissue bank is completing all of the donor medical histories and the donor testing before the products come to you. The regulations also address the end product. So if your product is changed in such a way by the minimal manipulation that it is no longer just a cellular or tissue-based product, something that is harvested from the body, cleaned, and given to somebody else, then your product may well end up a combination product. It could be a combination biologic device, biologic drug, in which case your regulatory path becomes a little bit more complicated. You have to have a determination made by FDA, by the Office of Combination Products, as to which center at FDA you would be most likely to deal with, whether the jurisdiction would fall within the Center for Drugs, the Center for Devices, or the Center for Biologics. And there is a little bit of a political tug of war there. So often it doesn't necessarily come down to the primary function of your product, which is what is intended. Sometimes it does draw in a bit of the political, and the more powerful centers can sometimes take control if they're interested in working on that particular product. And so we covered this a little bit earlier, but a lot of the regulations for these cellular tissue products, they have the term where appropriate built in. So this is what we were talking about with the framework structure for the regulations and the company's ability to take the framework and apply it to the work that they do. There are also regulations that apply to human tissue products from the American Association of Tissue Banks, the AATB, and the American Association of Blood Banks, AABB. And these are standard-setting organizations. They were formed by the industry. They are aimed at self-regulation, and they determine for their members the good manufacturing practices for the work that they do. It's very similar to FDA's structure for good tissue practices. So these organizations are relevant from a product's liability standpoint because the standards that they promulgate can be looked to in determining what the standard of care is for operating blood and tissue banks. The standard of care is important in causes of action based on negligence, which we'll discuss in more detail later on. But really, the standards that are set by these organizations tell you what a reasonable entity in that field, how they would act. And that is what you would be measured against in litigation down the road.
At this point, I'll kind of turn to discussing human tissue and human cellular or tissue-based products here and distinguishing them between a product and a service. And I should say here at the outset that I'll use human tissue or blood and tissue kind of interchangeably to refer to what Kate's been talking about up till now, these human cellular or tissue-based products. Now, the most critical question in determining liability surrounding harvesters, processors, and other users of blood and tissue products are whether these materials constitute a product or instead whether their sale is rendering a service under the law. In effect, does the law consider human tissue to be a product subject to products liability law or a service? Now, if we were to just look at the contracts between manufacturers that utilize tissue, for example, manufacturers of spinal implants that utilize allografts and implantation, those contracts are clearly structured as they would be with suppliers of any other product. The contracts regard the tissue as a product, and their contracts correspondingly take the form of most sales contracts and contracts for the sale of goods under the Uniform Commercial Code, the UCC. That said, there are strong public policy grounds for deeming blood and tissue as not as products, but actually as services, and thereby protecting distributors and processors from products liability that attend traditional products. So on these public policy grounds, every state has some form of what are called blood shield laws, although they usually apply to most human-derived material like plasma and tissue. And these statutes deem the sale, distribution, and processing of these materials as a service. Blood shield statutes are legislative recognition of the critical importance of the availability of blood and tissue, as well as a recognition that strict liability in applying that standard to these products would destroy their supply. UCC also explicitly rejects the notion of blood and tissue as a product and says that the traditional goods, sale of goods contracts are not to be applied to those entities. So what does this mean? Why is this relevant for life sciences companies that they're so often under the law designated as a service? For one thing, it means that strict liability is not applicable. That's the first important consequence of this designation. This legal theory, which imposes liability on manufacturers and distributors of so-called defective products without proof of actual negligence or wrongdoing, cannot be applied to processors and distributors of blood and tissue. So this is a protection of sorts for blood and tissue entities. The second big consequence is that the UCC's, the Uniform Commercial Codes, applied warranties of merchantability and fitness, which automatically attend to all commercially sold goods and guarantee that the products conform to the buyer's reasonable expectations and are fit for their intended purposes, are also not applied to blood and tissue. So these implied warranties are not automatic for tissue and human cellular products. Finally, and perhaps the least understood by many in the life sciences industries, contracts for the purchase, use, and or distribution of blood and tissue must be structured like service contracts rather than like typical sales contracts. None of the UCC gap fillers or other potentially applicable provisions will provide to the sale or transfer or distribution of blood and tissue products. That said, it's important to note that although they are extended this protection, and I did say that every state has some form of blood shield statute, the statutes vary significantly from state to state, and so thus do the degree of protection for those blood and tissue services. They differ in both the limitations on the recipients of that protection and the extent of the protection itself. So, for example, sometimes it's only the medical professionals that are utilizing human blood and blood derivatives for medical purposes that are deemed to be conducting a service, and other entities that are actually selling the products or blood and tissue for profit are not given any protection. So all that is to say that these blood shield laws are not a panacea. Life sciences companies handling human tissue cannot assume that they'll be protected by the state law. There are several claims that remain, even though strict liability, at least if it's deemed to be indeed a service, will not be applicable. Negligence will still remain, and that will prevail anytime they can prove, that is, the plaintiff can prove that there was a duty of care that was owed by the blood or tissue dealing entity, and it was not comported with, and as a result, the plaintiff suffered harm. So there could be negligence on the manufacturer side, for example, that spinal implant manufacturer, if they didn't select the appropriate tissue or blood bank. Maybe they had a record of known compliance issues or known contamination issues. The manufacturer could certainly be liable and held to be negligent for not having screened their supplier appropriately. And again, it's very similar with component part manufacturers. When they don't exercise the appropriate supplier controls, they can be found negligent and have liability for that. And again, some products liability theories will still apply in some states. So when human tissue is sold for profit, there are several states that don't view that as deserving of the same public policy protection, and thus they will allow these tissue banks or harvesting organizations to be sued on products liability theories. Also, when they're distributed by entities other than tissue banks or medical professionals, sometimes those other distributors are also not applied the same protection. And I think I'm going to give it back to Kate, and she'll kind of illustrate an example of how these laws can play out.
Thanks, Courtney. We're going to move on to our case study, and in this situation, we're taking a look at a patient who has suffered from poor teeth quality and gum disease for quite a while, and recently began to lose some teeth. He went to see his dentist to see what options were available to him in order to repair the damage that had been done. And his dentist thought that he might be a good candidate for a dental implant. So the dental implant we're talking about is a plate that is permanently attached to the jawbone with screws, and then the false teeth, the replacement teeth, are connected to the plate that has been installed into the jawbone. Because the device is attached to the gum with a screw, the dentist explained to John that testing was needed to ensure that he was a good candidate, that he had enough healthy bone tissue to support the plate that was going to be screwed into his gum. The test revealed, unfortunately, that John's jawbone decay was much worse than they had anticipated, and there was not enough healthy tissue to properly secure the implant. So in this case, the dentist recommended performing a bone graft in which donor tissue would be transplanted into John's jaw prior to placing the implant, and therefore the donor tissue would fuse with John's own existing jawbone tissue in order to create a deeper, stronger surface to hold the implanted device. John agreed, and the bone graft procedure was performed. And a few months later, after the bone graft had had time to heal, John returned for more tests, and the dentist was satisfied that the graft had healed sufficiently, and they were able to go ahead with the dental implant procedure. So this is the device we're talking about. You can see the yellowed portion that sort of looks sort of like a sea sponge. That is the natural bone tissue in John's jaw. And because of the degree of decay, the sinus had collapsed almost to the level of his gums. And if they had tried to put the screw into the jawbone as it was, it would have punctured the sinus, and it probably would have broken the jaw as well, the jawbone, because the jawbone was so very thin, and a certain amount is required in order to place the screw properly. So if you see the bone graft portion, that's what was implanted or transferred into John's jaw prior to the implantation of the dental device. And the graft tissue then joins with the original existing bone tissue, and once it has properly healed, it's generally quite strong and can support the dental implant. And then in the dental implant itself, you don't see the plate that the screws are holding in place, but there are spots where the new replacement teeth can be secured to the plate. So it is a permanent replacement for teeth that have been lost or had to be removed. So we're going to take a look at a couple of scenarios in which things went poorly for John after the completion of his procedures. And we'll take a look at how slight changes of the facts can drastically change the path for any litigation that may ensue following the negative outcomes for John. So in our first scenario, John is out for lunch and he takes a bite of a sandwich and immediately feels something shift and feels tremendous pain in his jaw. He goes to see his dentist, and the dentist determines that the screws holding the dental implant in place were not strong enough to bear the amount of force that would be expected when you're dealing with the normal action of the jaw. So the dentist determines that the implant needs to be removed, and the graft has to be evaluated to see if it's still strong enough to hold a replacement dental implant. So in this scenario, I will turn it over to Courtney here to tell you a bit about how the litigation might play out.
Sure. So looking at this scenario, this looks like more of a traditional products liability suit where we see a potentially or allegedly defective medical device and the plaintiff, the user, suffers harm. So here, although all of these parties are kind of probably likely to be named in the suit, liability will likely come down between the doctor and the manufacturer. So the manufacturer, and then it'll depend on whether the manufacturer itself is integrating and specifying the amount or density of the bone graft to be utilized, and then there's some potential liability there. And then the doctor for whether or not they were supposed to know the particular graft that was strong enough for this device. But it sounds to me like the screws here were the inadequate or the location of the defect, and the manufacturer is definitely going to bear some liability here. Again, that tissue supplier or that bone supplier is probably going to have some protection from the blood shield statutes and the refusal of both courts and legislatures to view that bone as a product, so they won't have product liability necessarily. But again, if that rises above the minimal manipulation, it can certainly be treated as a product. And then if the manufacturer is the one that's sourcing it and determining the specifications that are appropriate for its device, it's going to have some product liability as well. Kate, why don't you tell us about the second scenario?
Okay, so in our second scenario, the facts are a little bit different. Instead of taking a bite of something and feeling pain, one day John realizes that he has terrible jaw pain and that his gums feel inflamed. So he sees his dentist that day, and the dentist diagnoses an infected bone graft. Because of the extent of the infection, both the implant and the graft have to be removed. And so at this point, John may not be a candidate for a replacement graft and a replacement dental implant, depending upon the degree of damage that they discover was caused by the infection. So how does this changing of facts affect the outcome of potential litigation?
Courtney? Sure. So now where we've seen the introduction of contamination here, there's kind of an obvious motive for liability on the blood and tissue supplier. And again, although they're going to face some protection as having what they do would be deemed as a service rather than as a product, it's likely that there's some potential negligence allegations here. They're going to be looking to whether this tissue, this bone supplier, complied with the AATB standards promulgated by those industry regulations, as well as the good tissue practices that the FDA sets forth to make sure, are they screening their donors appropriately? Why is there still this contaminant issue? The manufacturer, they're responsible for processing the bone. Why was that not decontaminated appropriately? So they're also going to source some liability. And then, of course, there's always the possibility of negligence for the doctor and the hospital, or in this case, the dental facility. So it is going to be a little bit different when there's a contamination versus just utilizing the wrong specs for the particular bone or tissue or blood product. And I think it's a good time now to talk about what are the remaining theories or product liability and otherwise that can apply to all of these entities in this chain of distribution of blood and tissue products. So we'll go through strict products liability, because we talked about that can apply to some degree, negligence, breach of warranty, a battery, these are two tort causes, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. So looking at strict liability, this again is, it's widespread in torts, but in the product liability context, it aims to hold distributors and manufacturers of products liable whether or not the plaintiff can prove how they were specifically negligent. So it kind of eases the plaintiff's burden by letting them proceed in a cause of action with the only evidence being the product as defective, and thus we know that the responsibility for that must lay with the manufacturer or distributor. So while that's not, traditionally or I suppose conventionally available to blood and tissue products, because again, their designation as a service, where it rises above that minimal manipulation or where it is being sold for profit, there is a possibility for plaintiffs to proceed on the strict liability theory. Negligence is going to be another cause of action that plaintiffs are probably going to have more success with. They have more options. This can be shown, as we discussed before, it's almost per se negligence for these blood and tissue organizations to not be complying with their industry standards and certainly with the FDA's promulgated standards. So that is establishing, the combination of those is establishing a duty of care. And if the plaintiff can prove that wavering from that duty of care or not complying with those regulations cause the plaintiff harm, then there's certainly room for a negligence cause of action there. Moving on, breach of warranty. Again, these are usually uniform commercial code warranties that are applied to products. So in order to proceed successfully on a breach of warranty claim, you would need, or the plaintiff would need, the bone or tissue or blood products to be classified as products. So it's probably not something we'll see as much. Battery is going to require there actually be some exposure to some disease-causing factor like a contaminant as a result of a transplant and actual harm. Intentional infliction of emotional distress and medical monitoring are things that we've seen a lot of attempts at litigation for, the theory being that the plaintiff has had an implant and they have reasonable reason to fear that they have been exposed to a contaminant or a disease because of the implant. And they ask the courts to provide them, or the distributor or manufacturer of the blood and tissue product, to provide them with medical monitoring in case that exposure actually materializes or manifests into a disease. I wanted to bring this up as sort of an example that's kind of been in the public eye in the last decade or so. In 2005, there was sort of a large, very scary case of a company called Biomedical Tissue Services that had been snatching, if you will, bodies from funeral homes and actually harvesting their corpses and mutilating them for the extraction of bone and tissue without the consent of the family that is usually required. So they'd be paying the funeral homes to retrieve these corpses, sometimes actually replacing the bone segments they extracted with PVC pipes so that the family wouldn't know. It's estimated that about 1,000 patients received skin, tissue, and bone from these wrongfully harvested cadavers. The most significant problem, besides just the criminal element of body stealing, was that BTS was not registered with either of the industry organizations we mentioned earlier, was not complying with the screening requirements that the FDA has required. Instead, it was using cadavers that were significantly aged, that were cancerous and diseased, and thus posed a really significant contamination problem. So there's been several lawsuits as a result of this, and it's sort of still in speculation as to, we understand and widely acknowledge that the Biomedical Tissue Services that was doing the harvesting was performing criminal acts. The 5 companies that it sold to, what is their responsibility? And that's sort of being litigated and determined presently. They didn't verify any of the consent, and they didn't verify that the screening of the donors had been complied with. So the extent of their duties is sort of unknown, but it does provide some speculation that perhaps there's more responsibility for these companies to ensure that they are dealing with reputable blood and tissue banks, that they're sourcing and monitoring their suppliers just as they would suppliers of their component parts. So I'm going to turn it to Kate, who can tell us kind of how we can mitigate some of these risks that are attendant to blood and tissue services or products.
Thanks. It's important to remember that when you're talking about tissue products, it's really no different than any other product in the medical field when you are trying to mitigate risk. What we have discovered over the years is that there's a strong correlation between a lack of regulatory compliance, attention to detail, and products liability risk. So you want to ensure that you are operating according to all of the regulations that FDA has put forward, whether it's something in a guidance document or the good tissue practices. All of that information is available on FDA's website. And another thing to keep in mind is that where FDA is gradually moving from a calendar-based model for which firms it chooses to inspect to a more risk-based model where they tend to follow up regularly with firms that are consistently showing deviation from regulation, that a company with one bad inspection may be haunted by it for years. So it really does pay to put the effort in the beginning and make sure that you are operating in a compliant manner in order to head off both troubles with FDA in your own right as well as troubles in the products liability department. With tissue banking, you want to ensure that the tissue you're obtaining is coming from a reputable source. You want to find a tissue bank that is registered and is in good standing. You want to ensure you're getting and passing along a quality product. And it really is the duty upon companies working in tissue that they properly vet any vendors they're working with. If a company fails to properly screen its vendors, then they're going to bear a degree of liability because they've failed to meet that duty of care in ensuring that the suppliers are able to meet the standards placed upon them. And finally, contracting. This is something that is a good reminder for all businesses operating in this field that if you are using a vendor or if you are manufacturing for another company, you need to have a contract in place. When you're talking about human tissues, your contract is going to be a services agreement rather than a contract for goods or products. But as we discussed earlier, even then, you may still have, even if you do have a contract for goods, you may still be able to use that contract or rely on that contract depending upon the jurisdiction that you're in. Regardless, you want to ensure that the service agreements have certain provisions in place to protect you in the event of a product problem that stems from either failure to act or negligence of some sort on the part of your supplier or some degree of mishandling on the part of your customer after the product has moved on. So the important provisions to look for are indemnification. You want to see a bilateral indemnification where your company is taking responsibility for the actions you're responsible for, and that the other party is taking responsibility for any of their actions or negligence. And you want to ensure that in addition to that indemnification, there's also an insurance requirement that will ensure that the other party is able to meet the indemnification obligations that are created under the contract. The indemnification provision is really quite toothless unless you're insured of the other party's ability to pay. And with that, I believe we have come to the end of our session. This is an unusual situation for us in that we have presented in a pre-recorded format. However, if there are any questions that you have, please do feel free to contact us on our next slide. Courtney, I think you can advance it. Our contact information is available, and we would be more than happy to help or speak with any of you. And thank you so much for listening today.
Thank you.